I've never given a history talk before. It's mostly philosophy or math. So I found this actually quite difficult to get an interesting narrative of history out of it. Although a lot happened, it's hard to get a consistent story out of it. And I also kept something else in mind, which, I don't know, if you're like me, I prefer history talks that have interesting anecdotes and asides and give sometimes personal stories about the big players of the historical events. And it was not hard to find rather striking stories about Brouwer and Hilbert, among others. So hopefully I'll try to pepper those throughout to keep things slightly entertaining. But mostly this will be a philosophical, historical talk on Brouwer and the Formalists from about 1910 to 1930, right before Gödel, when everything changed. Okay, so why this topic for this class? So we've seen a lot of different versions of constructive mathematics. We've seen a lot of guises of intuitionism, both interpretations of intuitionistic logic, as well as semantic endeavors, which we spend a lot of time on. But if you're like me, I was kind of surprised when we read Brouwer, and Brouwer said, no logic, no mathematical language, that's not part of intuitionism. I did not expect that from the founder of intuitionism to be so anti-logic when I had identified intuitionism with the logic. So what is the relationship, proper relationship between this beginning intuitionism and logic? And how did we get logic out of it? And I guess I might have been the only one who cared about this one. What were the early days of intuitionism like? Why did this come up, and why is it still around in its many different forms today? How did it get started, and why is it still around? And although I wasn't interested at the beginning, now I am. What is the intellectual context of intuitionism? Did people care? Did people think this is interesting? Did they think it's stupid? Did they try to work through it, or did they just ignore it? Those are the kinds of questions I will hope to answer through this talk, but there are other things as well. The reason why I picked formalism as a contrast to intuitionism to really explore what intuitionism is about is formalism is because that's what intuitionism was, in some sense, compared to of the time. When Brouwer was around, there was no logicism, there was no really interesting philosophy of math that was not just either intuitionism or formalism, at least in Europe. And again, this is the 1910 to 1930 era. Formalism was the only comparison, really, to intuitionism. So that's why I picked this one. It's not an accident, though, that my advisor is a Hilbert scholar and such. So I will be slightly biased in talking about formalism. But we will restrict not just to intuitionism in general, but to Brouwer's intuitionism for exactly these kinds of reasons that he wasn't a big fan of logic. He was quite adamant about lots of philosophical things. He wasn't just a logician with preferences for some rules or the others. He had really strong opinions about, well, I would say too many things, but we will restrict to his views because there are plenty to get along with. And for the formalists, we will just be talking about Hilbert and Bernays, and I'll talk about who Bernays was and why he's in parentheses. The short story is that it's almost indistinguishable between those two thinkers, which one did what. They work together so closely that they're basically one thinker. Okay, so a brief review of Brouwer's intuitionism is, well, one, it's not an entirely unambiguous term. He disagreed with himself over time. His dissertation was not, he agreed with uniformly for the rest of his career, which, as we will get to, promptly ended in 1928 through a rather dramatic and I would say petty climax that we'll get to at the end. It's very, very dramatic and entertaining. I hope you like it. But up until that time, Brouwer did not use even the term intuitionism uniformly. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about when he said what and what kinds of intuitionisms he was talking about. As a refresher, we have a couple things worth emphasizing about his intuitionism. One is the first act of intuitionism. Mathematical language is not mathematics. The more slogan-y version of saying this is that mathematics is independent of language. This is true in general for Brouwer. Thought is independent of language because language is a pale shadow of the things that go on in human minds. And so that's a really big tenet, and this will be one of the major differences between intuitionism and formalism. Okay, he's also quite famous, and I was kind of surprised to see that he was solipsistic and mentalistic in his conception of intuitionism. Mathematical knowledge was not proof, it was not journals, it was not publication. It was mentalistic, what happens in my brain. I can maybe represent that in some poor way with language, but the real knowledge is in my head, and it's not about communication. My job is not to communicate my knowledge to you. It's about me having my own knowledge, because I'm the sole generator in some sense, the only one in charge of mathematics. But we all are our own charge of mathematics. So remember that this was a very interesting view of mathematical knowledge. Also, I want to say that I encourage you to ask questions, clarifications during the whole thing. This is kind of as a talk, but I want to treat it as a lecture. So,
okay.
Yes.
So just emphasize the contrast of Hilbert and Bernays, where two people with one mind.
I will talk about that.
It's like anti-solipsistic.
It really is. At the very beginning, yeah, Hilbert's collaboration with Bernays is immediately anti-solipsistic. But at the same time, Brouwer published. Brouwer was very famous for his work in topology. He spent a lot of time trying to convince other people that he was right. So again, not entirely uniform treatment of his ideals through his life, even in just these 2 decades that we're treating. Yeah, certainly Hilbert and Bernays were not solipsistic, and that would be a point of contrast. And tying back in some sense to what Kevin Kelly was talking about is that there was a Kantian restriction of epistemology to intuition. Everything in mathematics for Brouwer had to be generated from some basic set of intuitions. In several papers, he explicitly calls his work neo-intuitionism. The name hasn't really kept around very long, but it was based on Kant's intuitionism. And the reason why he calls it neo-intuitionism is because he gives up one of the major intuitions of Kant. Kant said space and time are like these 2 basic building blocks of knowledge, especially for the synthetic a priori. But Brouwer says, yeah, space is not that important. It's about time. It's about sequence of time. It's about iteration. It's about processes.
What's the term again? Neo-intuition? What's the word?
Neo-intuition.
Oh, neo, N-E-O. So like a modified intuitionism. Although he was still very explicitly indebted to Kant for his ideas. Related to the first point, logic is not normative. It does not tell you what to do. If you ask me why I made certain inference, my answer cannot refer to logic, because logic doesn't tell us what to do. It merely records, in a rather unreliable sense, and we'll get to that, what we do happen to reason like. But logic is not a reliable representation of mathematical thought, so it cannot be a reliable way to shape our mathematical discourse. It doesn't tell us how to reason or what is justified. Okay, so that should be somewhat reviewy. A lot of these terms are rather loaded, solipsistic, mentalistic, Kant, normative. All these things are quite robust, but we won't spend a lot of time talking about their, in some sense, the subtleties, which is why we're doing a comparison and not a close study of this. The comparison will bring out different aspects of intuitionism. Okay, so now the one that I assume you guys know less of, or at least in this class we've talked much less about, and it requires a little bit more talk. So their goal, Hilbert and Bernays' goal in creating formalism, although they never called it themselves, they were always referred to as that though, they wanted to solve foundational problems with a conception of meta-mathematics. And this comes in 3 layers. And this is a somewhat interesting, I think, interesting way of thinking about mathematics. And here's what the 3 layers in some sense say. The first layer is normal mathematics, the stuff you learn in class, analysis, algebra. Here's a definition of group, do some computations and prove these laws or something like that. Things are written in English or whatever the language you happen to speak. There's no explicit syntax, certainly not effective, and we don't have rules of inference to explicitly refer to. That's layer 1, normal mathematics, the stuff you learned before logic, if you did. Layer 2 is the formal representation of the informal mathematics. I know several people in the room do a lot of work on formalizing informal mathematics, And at this point, it seemed to Hilbert and Bernays that this was obvious and canonical way to do so. You have informal mathematics and you just formalize it. Like you just there's formulas to represent theorems, and proofs are just sequences of formulas. What's so hard about that? Of course, proof verification is not as simple as that. There's a lot of creativity and choice going on, but that's more a modern problem than a problem from this era. So that's the second layer, is the formalization of informal mathematics. The third layer is metamathematics. What kind of questions does metamathematics deal with? One, consistency, completeness, soundness, compactness. Anything about the system itself, anything meta-theoretic. If you want to talk about semantics, for instance, you're going to be in metamathematics. You have normal mathematics, the formal version of such, and then metamathematics talks about the formal versions of mathematics. If I want to know the consistency of analysis, I can't just go to an analysis book and look for axioms. I have to formalize the analysis and then look at the consistency of the formal system. And this was, in some sense, an innovation from Hilbert and Bernays, saying, if you want to get real answers to the consistency, the completeness, etc., of mathematical theories at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, you have to formalize first. You have to make mathematics itself, the language of mathematics, the object of mathematics. And so this three-layer distinction for mathematics was, I would say, the central point of Hilbert and Bernays, but I don't think that's a widely accepted view. Although the three-layer thing is accepted, I would call it central. So other people emphasize other things. Things to remember is that in metamathematics, that's where consistency happens. That's what Hilbert's program gets most famous for, proving consistency. But it turns out, metamathematics, this top level, the thing that talks about consistency, completeness, etc., and semantics, that level needs an a priori, intuitive, constructive epistemology. This will start a theme that I'm trying to sell in some sense, that there's a huge overlap between formalism and intuitionism. For instance, this third layer, metamathematics, is, as far as they're concerned, completely coextensional with Kroneker's finitism, and later they even claim it's exactly the same as Brouwer's intuitionism. So level one, normal mathematics doesn't get changed at all. Nothing happens there. But once we formalize and then talk about the formalization, we have to do this intuitionistically. And this ties back to, I think, a couple weeks ago, when we talked about semantics for intuitionistic logic. One of the worries with the Kripke and Beth semantics was that we couldn't really prove a lot of things intuitionistically in the meta theory itself. Hilbert and Bernays had exactly the right similar restriction, where in the metamathematical level, we're going to do it intuitionistically. Even talking about classical mathematics, metamathematics is going to be intuitionistic metamathematics, which is what we talked about with sheaf semantics, for instance. So that, to me, was surprising when I found this out. Hilbert and Bernays were intuitionists at the mathematical level, explicitly so, saying, yep, Brouwer is exactly right for this level. Also somewhat surprising, they thought we should be skeptical of the law of excluded middle. They're like, yeah, it's not obvious. It's not super obviously valid, so we're going to have to talk about it. And I'll talk about exactly how this differs from Brouwer's view. But at first, it seems pretty close to what Brouwer would say, at least for infinite domains.
What is layer 3?
The top layer is metamathematics.
Sorry, I thought the bottom layer was...
So normal, formalized mathematics about the formal languages. So meta theory of formal languages. Which is an informal thing, right? You prove completeness informally. You prove incompleteness. Yep.
So the Hilbert-Bernays conception of intuitionism, they had like a logic in mind, whereas you say like
no,
Brouwer,
no. Neither Brouwer nor Hilbert and Bernays had a formal view of intuitionism, because that needed an a priori, intuitive, constructive epistemology. So they just had this idea of what is given to us, and it's usually the natural numbers and constructions built on the natural numbers. That's the best answer I can give you. They can mostly point to examples of what's valid in intuitionistic mathematics for them. I would say finitary, that is anything finite, totally valid. Anything based on the natural number order, including constructive ordinals, which are certainly not finite in the same sense. So it's not strict finitism like Kronecker, who said only finite numbers exist, but it's something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
One more question. So you said Hilbert and Bernays were quite openly intuitionistic about, or advocated a form of intuitionism about the meta-mathematical level. One of Brouwer's complaints at this point was that he never got recognized by those damn formalists.
Yeah.
So where did they say this? Afterwards?
So the problem was, I guess, when I say they were very open about this, I should say they were very clear about this. They did not publish these things. They were mostly notes for lectures. In notes for lectures, they say explicitly, formalism is taking the best from Russell's logicism. You take the fact that you can use mathematical logic, and taking intuitionism from Brouwer. They viewed formalism as the combination of logicism and intuitionism. They said, yes, mathematical logic plus restricted epistemology. Put them together, you get formalism. They say this in lectures, and they say this in notes of lectures, but these were not published, certainly not during the time. And Brouwer is correct that he didn't get credit for things, but he's also someone who over-exaggerates claims of credit, and he takes insults very, very easily.
It was for them maybe what we call the trusted core of a proof assistant.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think Brouwer would have been very happy to have seen something like that in a published manuscript from the the 20s.
Yes.
Brouwer does recognize later, and we'll get to this, that formalism and intuitionism got closer and closer as the years went on in their published forms. But he was always complaining about recognition for this this closeness. He said Hilbert takes plenty of things, or has benefited much from intuitionism, and he will benefit much in the future if only he gets credit. And I'm going to start off a little slow, but we will get to the petty tirades that both Hilbert and Brouwer gave. I think it's funny and interesting. So, but we'll do some serious stuff first. So remember that right by this time, 1910, Russell and Whitehead had written Principia Mathematica, and everyone tried working through it. It wasn't super easy by anyone who's tried. In fact, G.H. Hardy gave a hilarious, at least I think, really funny story. Is that so Russell, he was relating something that Russell told him. I can remember Bertrand Russell telling me of a horrible dream. He was on the top floor of the university library about 2100 AD. That's the year. So very much in the future, 200 years. A library assistant was going around the shelves carrying an enormous bucket, taking down books, glancing at them, restoring them to shelves, or dumping them in the bucket. So deciding what to keep and what to throw away. At last, the librarian came to 3 large volumes, which Russell could recognize the last surviving copy of Principia Mathematica. He took down one of the volumes, turned over a few pages, seemed puzzled for a moment by the curious symbolism, closed the volume, balanced it in his hand, and hesitated. That was Russell's dream. And much later, Russell does say kind of things to the nature of, I'm not sure it was a good idea to try this. It was really hard, and he never wants to try it again. I thought that story was good. So, also by this time, Hilbert had axiomatized geometry to replace, in some sense, Euclid's geometry. Zermelo had done the same for set theory, not to replace anybody's so much as to give foundations and to avoid paradoxes, at least with hindsight. Russell had also given type theory, at least the ramified type theory with the axiom of reducibility, also in the same year, and then everyone was aware of the set theoretic paradoxes. So these are the kind of contexts that Brouwer and Hilbert are working on in 1910 to 1930. These are all accepted. And in fact, Bernays was hired by Hilbert as an assistant in 1917, in some sense to learn and teach logic with. Hilbert, surprisingly, maybe at least to me, didn't know any logic really. He had not read Frege, he had not read Principia, he had not read any of the previous Russell stuff or really spent time with it. He didn't know logic until about 1919. And so Bernays helped him do that. Although Bernays didn't know either, he just had more patience for it. Okay. Still in the historical context, I'm going to go a little faster now. So in 1911, Brouwer coined the terms. He's actually responsible for coining the terms intuitionism and formalism for the debate. And this was in a review of Mannery's book, someone who's related to his education. He saw parts of Mannery's book to be agreeing with intuitionism and part of the book to be agreeing with formalism. And so he wanted to separate the two ideas in this one book and give them names. He placed mathematicians in each camp to give kind of ideas of what he meant by the two terms. Intuitionism included Poincaré and Borel, and implicitly himself, Brouwer. In the formalist camp, and this was the very first time that this got used, so it's not really very good use of the word, but he placed Zermelo, Russell, and Hilbert. Nowadays, we do not consider either Zermelo nor Russell to be formalists. They're what we call logicists. But logicism didn't come around until Carnap, I think, coined the term maybe a decade or two later. It is funny to put Zermelo into the formalist camp, given that Zermelo was a full supporter of Brouwer's first act of intuitionism. Zermelo totally agreed that mathematical language can never represent mathematical thought adequately or completely. Seems strange from someone who axiomatized that theory, but he was actually very displeased with all the logic that Hilbert ever came out with, and he even tried to make an infinitary logic work with infinitary rules of inference, for instance, because he thought you can't reason about infinity with finite syntax. So I guess that's a side thing. He also made a strangely strong point about the fact that until Brouwer, the intuitionists were French, and he categorized all formalists, and they were all German. This wasn't, at least I didn't find this very clearly why he wanted to do this. Maybe it was, just a nice way to think about it, or maybe he was trying to make some serious political point. Either way, this reminded me of a point that, or a story that Jeremy Van Bentham, the logician, gave in a 2008 book. So Van Bentham did his PhD with the logician Martin Loeb, who was a very pure proof theorist. And as Van Bentham says, a gentleman from the grand old German school in mathematical logic and the foundations of mathematics. He goes on to tell the story. Of course, these were the revolutionary early 70s. I immediately rejected all intellectual views of my professors out of hand. He turned to modal logic, semantics, model theory, and the logician or proof theorist Loeb was disappointed. This is where I thought this was quite funny. Himself a Jewish refugee from Germany, his view that proof theory was about deep structure, elegance, style. Qualities he attributed, not coincidentally I think, to German and Japanese cultures. Whereas model theory was about fast images, muddling through, which he associated with Anglo-Saxon and French cultures. You see where this is going? And this is all Van Bentham's story. In his highly original view of history, this explained the core alliances in the Second World War. Proof theory versus model theory. That's what the war was really about. So maybe Brouwer was talking about something related to that.
A couple of things. So I think the analogy goes farther than you may have expected. There are so many great Jewish model theorists. But another thing is, so I think even before, so in 1911, Brouwer is well known at this point for the fixed point theorem, correct? But Émile Borel is already well known for his philosophical views.
Yeah.
So my first guess is that Brouwer would consider Borel to be a more canonical intuitionist.
Absolutely. So Brouwer did not think he was inventing intuitionism. He thought he was basing the stuff on Poincaré and Borel. He thought he was continuing that tradition, although he himself was obviously not French. He did think that that was the house of intuitionism until Brouwer came along. And not until later did he consider himself the center of intuitionism. But certainly at this point, he was like, yeah, intuitionism is French. Look at these two guys that are very famous and very influential. Okay. So both the Hilbert-Bernays unit and Brouwer were directly influenced by Kant's intuitionism, and they both explicitly said this, both in published and unpublished works. And I will be, in some sense, playing out this overlap and the fact that in the formalist sense, they were intuitionists at the meta level, and Brouwer was intuitionist all the way through. In fact, he only had one layer, so it didn't matter. And I want to point out that Brouwer and Hilbert were quite friendly before the big debate in the 1920s. The 1920s is where the debate will happen and where the drama will start. But before then, they were extremely friendly. And here's another story, not as funny, but I think revealing. Brouwer wrote down his impressions of Hilbert after he met him in 1909. So Brouwer's just starting his career. Hilbert is in his mid-40s, already an extremely established mathematician, still already the #1 mathematician of Europe. Everyone thinks about Hilbert as the #1. So this is Brouwer's words. Again, he waxed poetic, so bear with the terminology. This summer, the mathematicus of the world, he means Hilbert, was in the Netherlands. Through my work, I was already in touch with him, but now I have over and over again walked with him and talked as a young apostle with a prophet. So he's already considering Hilbert a prophet. He was 46, but young in spirit and body, swam powerfully, and climbed with the greatest pleasure over walls and fences of barbed wire. And then he says, as if this is the only thing in his life, it was a beautiful new shaft of life through my light through my life. So I don't know why they were climbing over barbed wire fences, but apparently he did it with the greatest pleasure. So they were very friendly. They talked. They climbed over barbed wire together. I don't know how else to become friends, but that works. Okay, so we're almost done with the historical context here. As Andrew pointed out, people did view Brouwer as an excellent mathematician, especially a topologist. And I have a bunch of quotes from the major figures of the time who talk about Brouwer. So people mentioned him, and this is a little after 1911, and sometimes in recollections looking back. So Einstein recognized Brouwer's genius, but thought Brouwer, I thought this was interesting. So Einstein thought Brouwer was an involuntary advocate of the Browser theory of the close relationship between genius and madness. So it says, yeah, Brouwer's a genius, but he's also an involuntary advocate of a theory that says geniuses are mad. Hilbert himself described in 1911 Brouwer as a scholar of extraordinary talent with a rare acumen. Very, very high praise from the mathematicus of the world, as Brouwer calls him. Max Planck noted that Brouwer was the first mathematician of the Netherlands, and together with Hilbert, the first of our time. So they were ranked right next to each other, the top of Europe. And although he always gets put second in that case, Weil himself, a student of Hilbert, although an intuitionist in some sense, said that of mathematicians I have met, Brouwer more than anybody else, with the exception of Hilbert, impressed me as a man of genius. Again, Brouwer, great. Hilbert's also pretty great. So that's what people thought about Brouwer before the debate started. And in fact, throughout the debate, his mathematical credentials were never really questioned. Like I said, Hilbert was the preeminent mathematician of the era, and he was in Göttingen, and that was the center of mathematics at the time. He made it his realm, and in some sense, he was all-powerful. Okay, so now to finally explain who this guy Bernays is, I don't know if any of you heard of him. So he joined Hilbert in 1917 as an assistant. He is well trained in mathematics and philosophy, and I was surprised to see how well trained he was. So to get a feel for the sort of influence Bernays had and where his training came from and how he, in some sense, fit himself into the academic world, here's his, in some sense, his pedigree. So he studied mathematics before coming to Hilbert with Landau, Frobenius, Schottky, Schur, Weil, and Felix Klein. And then he studied philosophy under Nelson, Riel, and Cassirer. And then he studied physics under Max Planck and Max Born. So that's quite a bit of education before he came to Hilbert. And of course, Hilbert was no slouch himself to teach Bernays. His students include people I think a lot of you have heard of. Gerhard Gensen, Haskell Curry, Saunders MacLean. The last one is not an official dissertation advisor, but since Bernays and Hilbert were so close together, he did advise Saunders MacLean quite a bit, who was Steve's advisor, if you didn't know. So Bernays, although a very quiet, shy man, was basically the philosophical backbone to the Hilbert program and had quite a bit of influence. He was also the one of the co-creators for the journal Dialectica, among many other things. Okay. Now we get to the philosophical agreements and disagreements. And maybe the agreements won't be surprising, but I don't think the disagreements will be that surprising. Okay. So on one axis, they could disagree on whether to be conservative or revisionary. So formalism was trying to verify mathematics in the vague sense of verify, to keep informal mathematics largely untouched, but add a mathematical apparatus, that is the second layer, the formalization, in order to study mathematics itself. So the problem, methodologically speaking, is how do we talk about mathematics correctly? Well, use mathematics to talk about mathematics. If you found a contradiction in the study, I think I can do that. If you found a contradiction in the study, then we have to do something. But we want to give a way to compare theories and to secure the ones we have. We do this intuitionistically, like I said. The meta-mathematics is intuitionistic mathematics, and we keep all the mathematics that's consistent. Everyone pretty much assumed that through this process, we would show that mathematics, as it was practiced in 15 or so when this happens, it was consistent. Okay. Brouwer had no such compunction. He wanted to rebuild or reconstruct mathematics on new foundations, restricted epistemology for all of mathematics, not just the meta-mathematics like Hilbert and Bernays, but all of mathematics. You lose some, you gain some, you change some, all for better epistemology in some sense. However, I do want to point out he was not ultra-revolutionary in the sense that he still wanted to study topology. He just wanted to do it in a slightly different way. So he didn't want to give up on all the traditions. He just wanted to mostly rebuild, reconstruct, not construct a new mathematics or build a new mathematics, but kind of revise the standard mathematics. I think I have a good quote for this too. Maybe not. Okay, so, but they agreed on something, which I've already emphasized, I think, plenty, is that for both of them, the finite natural numbers were unproblematic parts of mathematics, and they have an a priori intuitive basis. They are, in some sense, the reliable part of mathematics that we can base other things on. Formalism only had to secure things in the meta-mathematical level, so they don't have to worry about the intuitive side, the meta level. Intuitionism didn't have such a level, so it just had everything in mathematics had to be based on the a priori intuitive base. But in large part, they agreed that this was the starting point for really securing mathematical foundations. In fact, some people nowadays call formalism a type of sub-intuitionism. It's like a proper subset. It uses all of intuitionism for some of mathematics. But they had a very large disagreement as well in the relationship between logic and mathematics. As we all know, Brouwer did not like logic and thought it was a pale reflection of real mathematical thought. But Bernays and Hilbert were all on board with logic. In fact, that's what they intentionally did. They took the logic from Russell because they thought it was a great way to use mathematics to talk about mathematics. It has instrumental use, this formal logic, in providing a way to do meta-mathematics. In some sense, they were tired of doing philosophy. They wanted to do mathematics to solve mathematical problems, like methodological problems like completeness, consistency, and so on. Brouwer, of course, said mathematics is independent of language, and of course, therefore, logic. It happens in the mind, and language is inherently derivative and a poor record of mental events. And indeed, is unreliable, as we read the paper on the unreliability of the principles of logic. For the formalist side, Bernays puts it really well, I think. Mathematics no longer allowed philosophy to prescribe the method and bounds of mathematical research. Rather, it took the discussion of methodological problems into its own hands. How to do that? Well, just formalize things. That was their answer. That's how you make mathematics take its methodological problems into its own hands. You formalize. But Brouwer thought this had a really basic problem. It's a long quote, but I think the meaning is clear. It is true that from certain relations among mathematical entities, which we assume as axioms, we deduce other relations according to fixed laws, in the conviction that in this way we derive truths from truths by logical reasoning. But this non-mathematical conviction of truth or reality has no exactness whatever, and is nothing but a vague sensation of delight, arising from the awareness of the efficacy of the projection onto the world of experiences, and these relations and laws of reasoning. For the formalist, therefore, mathematical exactness consists merely in the method of developing the series of relations, and is independent of the significance one might want to give to the relations or the entities which they relate. Basically, when you're formalizing mathematics, you're formalizing vague sensations of delight when you finish a problem. It's not a proof. There's no exact way to get this to work. You're going way beyond what mathematical proof allows. You're saying, this is the only way, this is normative, this is what we should use for proof, versus you're basing this on vague feelings of, yay, I finished the problem. Obviously, for Brouwer, that's not a very interesting line of thought to formalize vague sensations of delight. But they had an agreement, which I only hinted at before, in the law of excluded middle. Formalism and Hilbert and Bernays say that the tertium non datur is not certain in infinite domains. Asterisks, I'll get to in a second. But it is certain in finite ones. This seems perfectly fine for an intuitionist, right? I shouldn't have capitalized the D, I don't think, but it's not generally valid, is what Brouwer will say, in infinite domains. It is in finite ones. This has notions of decidability going on. The asterisk is the next step. Formalists take the uncertainty of the law of excluded middle in the infinite domains to be a problem that needs solving. Not just a skepticism to maintain, but a problem to solve. How do we solve it? Show it's consistent. Done. We're not sure if the law of excluded middle is very good in infinite domains. Prove its consistency, and then it'll be good. So they're both skeptical, or at least worry about it, but then the formalist will try to solve it with some mathematical considerations, whereas Brouwer will not. Brouwer will take the basic skepticism. Yeah.
Actually, this is before like people knew a lot about incomplete, essential incompleteness and stuff like that.
Way
I
before.
think Brouwer often writes that in the same way that it is a problem to be solved. Okay, come and show me that you can decide all the statements in this theory, and then I will believe it in excluded middle for this.
The very next slide will talk exactly about that. But that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's the idea that the law of excluded middle is equivalent to the solvability of mathematical problems, all mathematical problems.
Yeah. That's where the real disagreement is. I mean, in some sense, I think Brouwer would be on with them that, okay, we can try to it's an uncertain principle, and we'll try to find out whether it should hold or not in some mathematical domain.
Yeah, he wasn't opposed to it, but he never really pursued it. But there's no philosophical reason, which is why this seems agreement to me. Yeah. But I do want to give an interesting idea, or interesting quote from Hilbert in 1922. So he gives an interpretation of the existential quantifier that depends on the domain being finite or infinite. So the interpretation changes using the difference of notions of there is and there is available. So this is the quote. For finite totalities, there is and there is available are synonymous. So basic existentials with decidable existentials are the same. For infinite totalities, only the latter, the fact that there is available, is clear without difficulty. So he actually interprets the existential quantifier in 1922, at least in this case. At least as Becker points out, these expositions could literally have been written by an intuitionist. The interpretation of the existential seems extremely intuitionistic, as long as you don't read too much into the without difficulty part. Because Hilbert does think that you can overcome the difficulty, but it does seem that he deals with similar problems as the intuitionists do, although the solutions are very different. And yet, in this quote, and Brouwer and Hilbert are already in this debate in 1922, Hilbert doesn't give any credit to Brouwer for this interpretation. And Brouwer is, quote, somewhat displeased that Hilbert ignores his things. His things. I don't know which language or what word his things was referring to. So this is already Brouwer being kind of upset that Hilbert's not giving him recognition. Okay, now we get to the disagreement of the tertium non datur 2. So for formalism, the law of excluded middle is not equivalent to the solvability of all mathematical problems. In fact, in the 1900 Paris lectures that Hilbert gave, he says, there is no I always forget how to say this word, ignoramus. That is, there's no problem that's unsolvable in mathematics. And he repeats this in 1930, right before incompleteness, which is somewhat ironic. But of course, Brouwer thinks that, no, the law of excluded middle's general validity is equivalent to the solvability of all mathematical problems. This is where you get his weak counterexamples from. If you have an unsolved problem, then the general validity is not obvious or not true.
Is that not supposed to be there in the second one?
No. Copy paste error. So they are equivalent for the intuitionist, they're not equivalent for the formalist. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. For the intuitionist, tertium non-datur is equivalent to the solvability of all mathematical problems.
So I'm a little confused by the first one. If they are not equivalent, and according to the second sentence, using some simple, classical rules, and basically the solvability is true in some sense.
Yeah, but they didn't want to commit themselves to the truth in general of this, as this slide shows. It's not. We don't think this is generally valid, obviously, in some intuitive way, as a formalist, and so we don't want to be committed to the idea that they're solvable because we want to say there are no unsolvable questions. But if these were equivalent, then this would mean that that's generally valid. Okay. But yeah, thank you, Evan. That they are equivalent for the intuitions. Okay. So this one's not that important, and I'll go quick through this one. Consistency for Hilbert was a big deal. At the beginning, he thought if you have a consistency proof, you've proved existence. If I can prove the consistency of his geometric system, then I prove the existence of such a structure. Later, he kind of thought it was, well, just a desideratum, something you need to do for a mathematical system. He had, at the beginning, model theoretic ideas of consistency, and then once he developed proof theory with Bernoulli, he had a combinatorial, or at least a syntactic version, where it's just the non-provability of falsum, or your favorite contradiction. But provability in a formal sense, whereas this is the non-formal sense. So this changed a lot, and there are entire careers based on Hilbert's program of consistency. I won't go too much into it. Brouwer didn't think much of it. He thought it was pretty irrelevant on whether a system is available to the mind. He was like, well, you've proven consistency, especially in the syntactic sense, using logic. It doesn't tell me whether I can do anything with it in my intuitionism. It doesn't guarantee legitimacy, and certainly doesn't justify new concepts or systems. It kind of went beyond just the fact that it used logic. He also thought there's a vicious circle involved. But the vicious circle is really hard to understand. At least I don't get it. And it's worded very poorly. Okay, so now to the drama. Pennies and groschen, personal politics. Okay, so Brouwer gave a lecture in Göttingen in 1924. And Hilbert begins to strongly disapprove. Not so much of the philosophy, but basically he starts to get, if you listen to the Dutch historians on this, and they're extremely divided, like Dutch historians are extremely behind Brouwer, and then the German historians are like, yeah, Hilbert's a saint. And so depending on who you read, you'll get a very different view of how things go on. And it gets absurd of how biased they are on both sides. So most of this history is from biased sources, but hopefully they're somewhat accurate, at least when they quote things. But Hilbert starts to strongly disapprove, and he starts to get, according to the Dutch, feel threatened by Brouwer. Hilbert's status as the preeminent mathematician he starts getting threatened. So he stands up at the end of the lecture, after saying nothing during the lecture, and this is unusual for Hilbert. Hilbert always says something during the lecture. He says, with your methods, most of the results of modern mathematics would have to be abandoned. And to me, the important thing is not to get fewer results, but to get more results. And he sits down to thunderous applause. Because again, this is Göttingen, his castle. Everyone agrees with Hilbert, and Brouwer is extremely disappointed because he still idolizes Hilbert. He still is trying to get approval from this somewhat father figure to him, this prophet, this mathematicus of the world. And Hilbert denies him and does not give him the approval. In fact, one Van Dalen, a Dutch historian on this, or someone sympathetic to it, he says this. So Weil was a student of Hilbert's who, in some sense, thought Brouwer was the best. Brouwer was his favorite above Hilbert, even though he was Hilbert's student. This really made Hilbert mad, or at least frustrated. And now I quote from Van Dalen, Weil had certainly provoked his old teacher, and the mathematical world saw Hilbert's counter-offense as the proper reprimand for a person who dared to challenge the supreme commander of mathematics. Neither Brouwer nor Weil answered Hilbert's attack in kind. Both men revered the grand old man, who, by the way, was only 60, too deeply to upbraid him for a spell of impetuosity. So the world, according to Van Dalen, saw Hilbert as squashing the rebellion, these, rapscallions trying to deny Hilbert's fame and importance. I don't think Brouwer saw it this way. And in fact, another mathematician at Göttingen during this talk afterward wrote in his diary, what Hilbert expressed there seems exactly right to me. If we have to go through so much trouble as Brouwer says, then nobody will want to be a mathematician. After all, and I think it's a very ironic line, after all, it is a human activity. Until Brouwer can produce a contradiction in classical mathematics, nobody's going to listen to him. So I think it's ironic that the reason why they don't believe Brouwer is because Brouwer is not close enough to human abilities. But you can, as we've kind of seen, his set theory is not immediately intuitive. His topology is not the most natural for at least people who have been classically trained in topology. And Hilbert considers Weil's speech as often calling Brouwer the revolutionary and savior. He considers this betrayal. And so he basically, from 1924, has a mission to destroy Brouwer. At least if you listen to the people sympathetic to Brouwer. Okay, so people in Göttingen, except for that one quoted, didn't like this. Didn't like how personal things had gotten. Didn't like the tensions between Hilbert, still #1 mathematician, and Brouwer, some prominent mathematicians viewing as the #2. They didn't like this. They thought there would be much better if they collaborated, if they talked more, amicably. So they came up with a plan, straight out of a silly movie. So the solution is dinner at Emmy Noether's house, who's famous for ring theory, field theory, ideal theory, stuff like that, and focus on anything but intuitionism. This was the bright idea of Alexandrov. He saves their relationship for at least 8 months. And here's the story, which I found hilarious. So they wanted to reconcile Brouwer with Hilbert. So Emmy Noether, the one responsible for ring theory and ideal theory, among many other accomplishments, she's actually fantastic, I think. She supplied the reconciliation. Weil had asked her to host dinner with Brouwer and Hilbert, since she was, and this is a quote from Weil, warm like a loaf of bread. Already off to a great start. And then now at the table, Hilbert and Brouwer, we also had Richard Courant, Edmund Landau, and young mathematicians like Alexandrov and Heinz Hopf, who co-wrote a very famous topology book together. Alexandrov started the conversation, and according to him, in his own words, the best way of getting two warring factions together is to find a common enemy. I'd give anyone points if they could figure out who it was going to be. I had no idea who it was going to be. Thus, Alexandrov brought up the subject of a famous Luckenwalder function theorist, P. Kobe. I have not heard this guy, don't know who he is. But Alexandrov's success exceeded all expectations. Hilbert and Brouwer were soon, quote, falling over themselves in a spirited exchange of opinion, during which they agreed over ever more in their view of that function theorist. The two became progressively friendlier and finished toasting each other at the end of the dinner. So they hated this function theorist, and they agreed completely about this. And by the end, and wine was definitely involved, they were very happy about each other. This lasted 8 months before the debate got even worse. I told you, this is drama. Top-notch drama here. Okay. Now, the title of this slide is going to be the title of the next, most of the slides. End of Brouwer's influence. This is how Hilbert destroyed Brouwer. This is the story. And I guess I want to, before we get into the even more drama, I want to emphasize that their philosophical differences were not that great. In fact, they lessened as time went on. And by 1928, I'll repeat at the very end of this, Brouwer even said, except for a couple of minor things, the difference between the two was a matter of taste. It started as a real opposition, but at the end, even Brouwer was like, it's just a matter of taste now between the philosophical doctrines. But by 1924, and then after again the dinner, it wasn't really about philosophy. It wasn't even really about mathematics. It became really personal, and that's why this thing happened. And depending on who you ask, it's someone else's fault. It's Brouwer's fault for being a strong personality. It's Hilbert's fault for being, power hungry or something like that. Doesn't really matter to me. But what does matter is that this does end Brouwer's influence as a mathematician, especially as one that talks about foundations. In fact, in a visit to Princeton in the 30s, people felt really sorry for him, but didn't listen to him anyway. So Brouwer visited Princeton in the 1930s, and people felt very sorry for him, and he felt very sorry for himself, and started trying to talk up how bad he had it, but no one listened to him, his mathematics or his foundations in the 30s. And he lived to a great old age, so he was around for a long time, completely abandoned by the mathematical community. But this was not because of philosophical success or non-success. In fact, he was successful to get Hilbert to basically adopt a form of intuitionism. And yet, I think Brouwer and his sympathizers are correct that he does not get the credit he needs for creating what became the standard, which is Hilbert's program, which is why so many people, like in this department, this philosophy department, do formalization. It's because of Hilbert. And yet, we don't remember that it's because of Brouwer that it works the way it does. I mean, why do we do Martin-Liff peg theory? Martin-Liff was extremely influenced by Brouwer. So although this thing will get purely personal from now on almost, it doesn't actually reflect the philosophical differences. And that's what's almost frustrating to anyone sympathetic with Brouwer, is that his ideas carried on in Hilbert's form, and yet Brouwer got completely marginalized after 1928. Here's the story of how Brouwer got marginalized. Okay, so this is after the First World War. The International Council of Research was a branch of the League of Nations, and it boycotted German, Austrian, Bulgarian, and Hungarian scientists. In fact, so they couldn't go to any international conferences. You also couldn't speak German in scientific discourses. It was a full ban on German languages in scientific discourses, not German languages, German, pushing to English and so on. Brouwer, though himself safe from these issues as not being German, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Austrian, campaigned heavily against this situation. He thought that Germans and the rest should be included in international conferences. He was extremely adamant and tried to lobby the committee on the International Council of Research, or whatever it's called, to allow German participation. Funny enough, on a related committee that influenced this committee on research, Mussolini was the head of. So it was extremely political at this time. But then, I don't think it's due to Brouwer at all, but then the boycott on Germans was lifted. They could attend international conferences again, but they were not allowed. They were allowed to give lectures, but they were not allowed to be full members of the conferences. For instance, the International Congress of Mathematicians happened in 1928, when this will happen. I think I actually have points I should be showing you. And this is going to be, the International Congress is going to be held at Bologna. So the council changed their opinion, and they allowed Germans to come to the Bologna conference. And this is a big deal. Some German and Austrian mathematicians did indeed join Brouwer, who started advocating the boycott of this conference. They said, don't go to the Bologna lectures, boycott this. This committee does not get to control you. If you have the bravery of Germans, don't go. And and he also said this to Austrians, and some did join Brouwer in avoiding the conference. There was no official delegation from Berlin, for instance. Hilbert went, didn't care what Brouwer said, and he came with a large contingent from Göttingen, of course, still extremely influential city and department. and he strongly opposed the boycott. In a draft of his own letter, where Brouwer sent out a letter advocating everyone to avoid the conference, Hilbert sent out a letter that said he viewed the boycott as political oppression. And this quote is worth stating in full. In Germany, this is Hilbert. In Germany, a political blackmail of the worst sort has come into being. You are not German, German birth unworthy, if you do not speak and act as I now prescribe you. It is very easy to get rid of this blackmail. One need not only ask them how long they have laid in the German trench. Unfortunately, German mathematicians have fallen victim to this blackmail. For instance, Bieberbach was on Brouwer's side. Brouwer has understood how to make use of the situation of the Germans, and without himself giving a hand in German trenches, causing all the more incitement and discord among the Germans, in order to pretend being the master of German mathematicians. With all success, he will not succeed a second time. So Hilbert viewed Brouwer as a political oppressor to Germans, completely appropriating German struggles, German problems as his own, saying, I am the champion of Germans, I will protect you. And Hilbert finds this to be blackmail. Of course, that means he feels insulted by Brouwer's involvement in this whole thing. He was not in the trenches. He's never been, had problems that the Germans had. Turns out, most people listened to Hilbert. Germans were only outnumbered by Italians at the Bologna Conference, with the only notable exception being Bieberbach, who was somewhat prominent at the time. Okay. Something I didn't say, but Brouwer was on the editorial board for the Mathematische Annalen, which was the major, single most influential journal in all of the mathematical communities, especially in the West. And he put him on the editorial board in 1915. Again, Brouwer was extremely respected as a mathematician. And this was extremely good for Brouwer's career, among other things. Brouwer immediately accepted. He thought this was a great honor. And indeed it was. The chief editors were Einstein, Hilbert, Carathéodory, and Blumenthal. I think they say Carathéodory. But when Hilbert returned from Bologna, he wrote to Brouwer that he was now dismissed as a member of the editorial board. Hilbert unilaterally, without asking any of the other editors, just wrote a letter to Brouwer dismissing Brouwer from the editorial board. Carathéodory, who was Brouwer's friend and disagreed with Hilbert's decision, got a telegram before Brouwer got the letter, and so warned Brouwer, hey, you're being dismissed. Hilbert's going to dismiss you from the editorial board. However, in the end, Carathéodory did agree with Hilbert because Hilbert got sick. Hilbert was really sick, and so Carathéodory felt pity, and so agreed with Hilbert's view that Brouwer should leave. I don't really understand why. But Hilbert was sick, so Carathéodory, in some sense, abandoned Brouwer in this sense, although he did still warn him. Einstein refused to give in to Hilbert's demands, and Hilbert wasn't king of the journal. He was just one editor, so was Einstein. And he pleaded. He said to Hilbert in a letter, "Sire, give him a jester's freedom." Not exactly the most supportive to Brouwer, calling him a jester, but at the same time denying Hilbert's power to unilaterally kick people out of the editorial board. And Brouwer told Carathéodory that he would comply with Hilbert's request only if Hilbert's physician would state in writing that Hilbert was of unsound mind. Only because the only reason why Hilbert would ask that is since he's sick and he's of unsound mind. He's an insane person. He said this in writing in the letter. Blumenthal, who I have not mentioned yet, but is the fourth major editor, main editor of the journal, found this extremely tactless and turned on Brouwer and joined Hilbert. So he was extremely offended by this request. So Brouwer's like, I will not leave unless Hilbert's deemed insane. And Blumenthal's like, whoa. All right, that's too much. So the only solution that was to be had, because Einstein and Carathéodory, in the end, did not want to kick out Brouwer. Of course, Brouwer didn't, but he didn't have a choice. And Hilbert and Blumenthal did. So it was in some sense a split vote. if it was democratic. So instead of trying to figure out how to solve this, they just dissolved the editorial board. And maybe not surprising, Hilbert, Blumenthal, and the mathematician Hecke created their own editorial board. Didn't have Einstein, didn't have Pierre Theodore, and of course, never had Brouwer. So Hilbert gets back from the Bologna lectures, sends a letter without talking to the other editors that Brouwer is no longer an editor of the journal that everyone wants to be an editor of. Drama ensues, and so they just dissolve the board, and they make a new one. Brouwer is devastated by this. So not only was it an honor in 1915 when he got offered this job, it's extremely harmful when he lost it. Let's see, what was that? I mean, he idolized Hilbert, and the fact that Hilbert turned on him so fully to kick him out of the one job he actually liked ruined him. And although there's no good record of how Brouwer responded to this exact thing, other than deep depression, which is understandable, I have a couple anecdotes on how Brouwer reacted in general to things that upset him. He was a bit of a touchy person. So in this side, basically, after negotiating more pay for his job in Amsterdam by leveraging offers from Berlin and Göttingen, which Hilbert offered him a job at Göttingen because he thought he was a great mathematician. Brouwer immediately left for Berlin after getting more pay from Amsterdam. So he went back to Berlin. Friedrich van Eden, a good friend, wrote in his diary, a good friend of Brouwer, "I heard that Brouwer was in the country and left again for Berlin. He has wounded himself with some glass when he kicked in a window in his house because it was closed. And that without telling me. He loves me after all in another way than I love him." Okay, it's a little odd that he kicked in his window to get in his house. Van Dalen comments that indeed Brouwer was short-tempered where such obstructions as closed doors or the like were concerned. A classic category of anger. And Brouwer used to drop in occasionally to see a journalist living in Belgium with whom he was on good terms. So there's another case of this. Once, when he did not find the journalist in his office, Brouwer got so angry that he kicked in a window. Interesting. Fraenkel, who we all basically remember from Zermelo Fraenkel's set theory, was an extremely integral part of, had extremely integral parts into the foundational debates of this era, including his very influential book, Introduction to Set Theory. And in that introduction, he includes part of intuitionist set theory based on Brouwer's work. And he tries to represent stuff that Brouwer hopefully will agree with. He's like trying to, do this accurately. He's extremely impartial, very neutral. He's trying to represent Brouwer's intuitionistic set theory inside of his set theory book. So he sends a manuscript to Brouwer asking for comments, like, is this what you believe? And there was one comment on the Cantor-Van Dixon theorem, which states that every closed set is a disjoint sum of a countable set and a perfect set. The details obviously don't matter that much. He thought that was trivially true in intuitionistic set theory. And Brouwer has published something that said the same thing. Brouwer changed his mind and thought that that was not the case. It was trivially true for deconstructible sets, but not in general. And so his view changed as well, but Fraenkel didn't know this. But Brouwer, of course, thinks that he should have known this, obviously. And this is the quote from a letter from Brouwer to Fraenkel. "Should you stick to this insulting and hollow insinuation that he believed the Cantor-Van Dixon theorem is true, even after my urgent request and urgent advice to strike them out, then the competent reader, as I claim to be myself, can only read this as a declaration of war on me. I ask myself in vain what grounds I may have given you. Forgive me that I write sharply and clearly, but I have to do this also in public." So he was not one to let things go. He was described as a good friend, as an expert at nurturing grudges. And in some sense, it was that personality combined with Hilbert's desire to keep his power status that in some sense ended Brouwer's career. So now we're going to have a little recap.
Make it quick. We're out of time.
This is the last slide. So back to philosophical stuff. Formalism and intuitionism. as doctrines were largely compatible. They were motivated by similar tendencies, in fact, both explicitly so by Kantian tendencies. We don't want to do this Platonic access realm stuff. We want to have a constructive, and they both use the same phrase, constructive, Hilbert more than Brouwer, ways of constructing objects, of proving things. The locus of intuitionism for Hilbert and Bernays was the meta level. The locus for Brouwer was, of course, all of mathematics. But as they grew, as philosophies go, they got closer and closer. And as I said, in 1927, 1928, right before the journal debacle, when he got kicked out of the journal, he claimed that except for the equivalence of the tertium non-datur to the solvability of problems, it was a matter of taste. And that's pretty surprising to me. I thought these were kind of mutually exclusive philosophies of mathematics, and we get told this a lot. In fact, in our philosophy department, we read an article that gives us the tripartite distinction: logicism, formalism, intuitionism, and all three articles will say, like, yeah, this is the only one that's correct. During the time, logicism wasn't a thing, and formalism and intuitionism were very, very close, which I found surprising. So I also want to say, so yeah. But this closer and closer of philosophical doctrines, and by some commentators, was the explanation for why it got so personal, is that Hilbert felt more and more threatened by Brouwer's fame because he was starting to say similar things, or at least Hilbert was starting to say similar things to Brouwer. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I'm not super expert on this, but the philosophical closeness was followed almost immediately by a deep and harsh falling out between protagonists. And I do want to say, except Bernays, who kept extremely cordial relationships to all of them. No one was ever angry at Bernays. And someone who's famous for making fun of people, Gerhard Kreisel, never said a bad word about Bernays. The one person, and I think Saul Pfefferman even says this, the one person Kreisel never disliked was Bernays, which is something to say, I guess. And it removed all hope of reconciliation. Brouwer completely left the foundational debate, and in some sense, Hilbert won. And you can kind of see that now. You can kind of see what people spend their time doing in foundational research these days. And the fact that proof theory is so prominent does say something about Hilbert's success. And the fact, again, that we think of intuitionism as a type of logic and not as a philosophy of mathematics so much, again, attests to Hilbert's success. That formalizing mathematics is the first step to getting an interesting philosophy. So I, as I assume, at least the people I've talked to, were also under the impression that intuitionism was intuitionistic logic. When I wrote a paper that did this, and Wilfried, my advisor, says, no, intuitionism is Brouwer, intuitionistic logic is not Brouwer. So Brouwer lost this debate. People took the formalist mathematical logic side much more in hand than any of the stuff that Brouwer did, especially for his set theory. Although not to say that constructivism isn't influential, which of course it is, but Brouwer's type, it lost. Okay, so that's the Brouwer and the formalists.
We're over time, but we can have perhaps the question if there's burning with a question.
I hope it wasn't too boring.
It was fun.
Yeah.
That's fine. So, back to the first slide.
The
second slide.
Second slide?
It's about the characteristics of the intuitionist. So as far as I remember, the characteristics of being solipsistic, cognitive Brouwer doesn't prevent communication.
It certainly doesn't prevent
communication is kind of second-grade.
Exactly.
But it's possible to recreate the same whatever. It's a mental process. Mental construction.
Yes, you can do work to represent what happened in the mind of the creative agent. But Brouwer, at least in several instances, he doesn't always say this, but it's not a full representation. The true mathematics is still in the mind of the mathematician, and you can represent parts of it by communicating, by publishing things.
And then the goal is to recreate the same thing.
Yeah.
By another.
Some type of empathetic idea, yeah.
Yeah.
I have an idea. I do my mental stuff, which is mathematics. I write something down, hoping that you do the same mental stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, but it was always a lossy procedure, and so it didn't preclude him from publishing. But in his more philosophical and mystical writings, he was very strong, and that language was a lie. he says this all over. In lots of contexts.
I mean, I do understand that. It seems that there's a way to. Yeah, it's secondary. Still, communication possible.
Certainly possible. I agree. But his argument against formalism was often that it emphasized too much language. So it's a question of emphasis, right? He's like, yeah, it's mostly the mental stuff, and you use communication to do mental stuff. Whereas the formalists were like, nah, I don't need to incur like intuitions in you. I can just show you the proof. So it's still a difference, but I agree it's not as black and white as this might indicate.
There's one anecdote. I think it's actually true, but I think there's a picture in Banana's book that the belief of Hilbert in the solvability of any mathematical problem was so strong that the inscription on his tombstone is, I think it's in German, wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen. So we have to know. We
will know. Yeah, and he repeats both the no ignoramus claim that there's no unsolvable question, and this in 1930, and he podium bounding excitement.
Yeah, right.
We must know. We will know.
There's the radio address was recorded, and you can listen to it now. It's really fun.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll send you the link.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Here he'll say, "Wir müssen wissen. Wir werden wissen." Okay, we'll stop it for that.